So a little bit of a review from just the last hour. We live in circumstances. We have various components of our life that we experience. We have God is overall. We live and move and have our being within God. Our circumstances are around us. It's what we experience. It's what we're doing. We have events and situations. We have people in our lives. We have responsibilities to take care of. There's things that happen to us that we can't control. All these things are constantly in our life. And we're dealing with them. How we deal with them comes from what's in our heart. The value systems. I kind of switched this a little bit. The last one I used the word desires. This session I'm using the word value systems. And I want to connect those two. And Tim gave a good. He ran himself into the same place that I did when I was studying this. He said, "Well, I'm not sure how he's going to tie the first part to the second part, and values and which leads to what, and how does this." So I hope I can tie them together well. They made sense to me, and I hope they do to you. So value systems are related to desires very, very carefully, very closely. And then we have temptations, and then we respond to them. And we talked about that last time. So let's talk about values. Jesus summed it up really nicely. This is the heart of it right here. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Substitute treasure for values. Substitute values for treasures. We could probably almost substitute desires for treasures. But what is a treasure? Something that has a lot of value. Something that's important to us. And Jesus connected the two for us so we can kind of get an understanding of how they work. And remember the rest of that, I think in another place where he talked about what's the outworking of that when our treasure is not where it should be. We'll talk about that. So what are values? My definition, we worship what we value in our heart. We want to connect always worship with what we do, what we value, everything that goes on in us. We are worshipers. It's the function of our heart. It's what it was designed to do. And our value systems are reflected in what we think, say, and do, which is reflected in what we worship. They're all interconnected. So values are, another way to put it, they're important and lasting beliefs or ideals about what's good and bad, desirable or undesirable. So defining it a little more closely this way, values have major influence on a person's behavior and attitude and serve as a broad guideline. I almost thought that perhaps I should have done values first before going into worship, but it's okay either way. Just realize it's not step one, step two. This is just two parts of the same thing. We're just examining a little deeper where it comes from. So our value system, I'm calling it a value system. You could also call it core beliefs, core values. It's a little group of things that are important to us. And it's the foundation of our morals and ethics. The next topic is going to be on morals. So where do morals come? What are morals? How do they get defined? I think we're going to hear about that. But morals are closely tied to our values. We will behave based on what we value. And values, okay, now we have a system of value systems, core values, they're all the same thing. It's just we have a group of them. We have many of them. We don't have just one value. We have many things we value. So we just for a way to talk about them, we call them value systems. and they're a group of values reflected in the choices and desires we make. They also form our worldview. This also could be another topic, but just briefly, a worldview is the way we look at our world. How do we interpret our world around us? From a Christian viewpoint, our worldview includes God. From a non-Christian viewpoint, a worldview does not include God. So that's going to drastically change how we interpret what's going on around us, how we interpret ourselves, how we interpret behavior, how we interpret reactions. So, again, boiling down to worldview and then values, they are closely related. I thought this interesting. I just noticed this the other day. Romans 5 talks about living according to Romans 8, verse 5. That's where he's talking about living according to the flesh or living according to the Spirit. So living according to. Think about that phrase. Doesn't that speak of values, a value system, a system of thinking? It's the values we live according to. And I like the way that put it. And I think it connects well, because if our values are based on what we know from what Scripture tells us about life and ourselves, we live according to them. They are our value system. They are our worldview. And I mentioned this at the last one. This is just, and again, this is my little way of thinking about this. They're kind of like a DNA. DNA, if you understand DNA in our cells, it's the pattern that pieces break off and then become new cells, and the pattern that comes from that DNA tells what kind of cell that's going to be. So in a similar sense, our value system is the pattern from which our desires arise. It's where they come from. If I value honesty and integrity, then the things I desire are going to reflect that. I'm going to desire truth, and I'm going to desire telling the truth. But if what's important to me, if I value self-fulfillment, then my desires are going to reflect that. I'm going to look for things that satisfy my fulfillment, that fulfill me, make me feel good. That's how I tie the two. It's kind of a mind thing. So another way to say it is, it's the grid by which we interpret our world, our value system, the things that are important to us. Here's just a little list of some values. I found on the internet somebody put together a list of over 250 values. And they were good. They were good little descriptions. One word: acceptance, accomplishment, beauty, bravery, cleanliness, control, fairness, ferociousness, honor, recognition, strength, structure. All these things are things that become important to certain people. So perhaps you can get a sense of how they can affect us, how they can affect you. Well, where do values come from? They've got to come from somewhere. We're not born with them. So they are developed. They develop in time. They've been developed through a number of things. Now, I'm not here to... These are just things that came to my mind. They're not really scientific or proven, but it's kind of just intuitively, that seems like this is where they come from. God, of course, is number one. He's sovereign over our circumstances. We live in our circumstances. Those circumstances affect us. They influence us. So, therefore, some of those values come from God. But God's not the only thing we live in. It's not the only thing we're affected by. The things we've experienced in life as children, as young adults, and I spoke of events that can happen to us. Those can all affect how we form our value system. Beliefs. If we go to church, we hear certain teachings, we believe certain doctrines. Here I could realize that Value systems can affect our beliefs, and beliefs can affect our value systems. It can kind of go both ways. The culture we live in is a big one. If I lived in China, and I grew up in China, I'd probably have a different value system than I did growing up in America. In certain ways, certain places. Religion is important. If I grew up as a Hindu, I'd probably have a different set of values than I do as a Christian. Satan, of course, is in the picture as well. He has an influence. We can't ignore that. We don't want to make it too big, but we don't want to make it too small. And I'm not here to define for you the relative strengths of these influences. I'm just want to lay them out that a number of things really affect our value system. Then our relationships. What do our relationships mean to us? And how people treat us, they can have an effect on forming our value system or changing our value system. So how do they affect us? I see it as a big factor in how we look at our surroundings as coming from the pattern of our value system. The core values, the core things that are important to us, they are the thing that, like the engine that drives how we're going to perceive what's going on around us. And in turn, they affect our choices and the things we desire. So like I said, it's kind of like the pattern for our desires. A person who values honesty is not going to have a desire to lie. Kind of just a simple correlation there. And they affect our responses to circumstances. Now, last time I talked about desires and how they're key in the process of idolatry, where we go from desiring something and so forth. This is to me where it kind of blurs and blends. The value systems and desires are tightly linked. Right? It'd be hard to just firmly separate them two and make them separate. And I'd also like to propose the idea that we can have public and private value systems. We can portray ourselves as having a certain set of values that others appreciate, and particularly around us, and yet we can also have a private one. And which would you guess is the more accurate one? Between a public set of values that people perceive us having and the one that other people don't know about. Which do you think would be the real one? Because don't we know people? I don't know if I should put it that way. We're going to have a case study that, like I said before, it involves a situation. I'm not sure, but I think the person, the abuser, is well known in the church environment, having a good reputation. So people would say, well, he's got a good set of values. Of course he does. But behind the scenes, some very bad things are going on. So which would be the real value system that's in that person? That's kind of what I mean by public and private one. So this is pretty obvious. A value system that's based on God and His Word will contain His values. So those values would affect us a certain way, meaning they come from God, we've adopted them, and now they are ours. This is what I think Paul is talking about in Romans 8. Verse 6, he says, to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. That's where he talked about living according to. To set your mind on the values of God gives us a different value system, probably than what we're naturally inclined to do. So we're taught we would be more inclined to live according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh. You flip that over, and a value system that's based on the self and the flesh will contain values that reflect that. They'll benefit self. They result in desiring things that the flesh desires, and kind of like we talked about the last session, those are what we want. We're going to look out for things that get us. The other word is takers. We're a giver or a taker. So living according to the Spirit, having a value system based on God's values, motivates us to be givers. A value system that's based on us, ourselves, what's important to us, they will tend to lead us to value the things the flesh wants. Paul said, those who are in the flesh cannot please God, for those who live according to the flesh set their mind on the things of the flesh. That's based on their value system. That's kind of the soil from which they arise. So I'm talking theoretically a lot about in these 2 sessions, but I wanted to try to tie this to what's coming up. So I just kind of thought, what would an abuser's value system be like? And again, would that be a private one or a public one? I think we could probably all guess it's probably a private one. Because who wants to just public or proclaim that, oh, it's important to me that I'm going to use your door whenever I want to. Now, it does get to that point. It can get to that point, and then some people are like that, but it's pretty rare. So what would you call this? In the same line of that other list that I gave you, here are a couple that I guess, maybe you could come up with others. Entitlement. Thinking that I'm entitled to get some satisfaction. And if I can't get it a certain place, I'll get it another way. Power. The control of people so that I will get what I want. Exercising that power over people. And certainly children under our authority are a prime target for that kind of value. Secrecy, which for most, it's kind of built in that sin likes to hide in darkness. So secrecy is an important factor, important value for a person who is like this. Gratification, that's an important thing, to be gratified, to have the flesh gratified. Self over others. People are objects. Narcissism, I included there simply as it's really not a biblical term. I think it's a psychological term, but it does accurately describe an extremely self-centered person who is, everything in their being is about getting. And no longer is it really hidden very well. It's pretty well known. So I was just guessing a few terms, a few ideas that would help us connect which is coming up, a value system that this kind of person would have. So I thought, okay, what kind of words would also describe an abuser that we could find in Scripture? A number of these come from Proverbs. Like I said earlier, Solomon was exceptional at understanding and labeling and defining human behavior. I think that was one area, at least, where he was extremely wise in. So he talked about the angry person, cruel, evil, a flatterer, fool, froward, or perverse. Kind of depends on the version that you're using. Some of these come from the King James. A hater, a hypocrite, murderer, a reviler, or a railer. Kind of depends on, the translation you're using, which one of those terms will show up. Each of these would, I'm going to assume for now, for the discussion, you know what I'm talking about. I don't need to define these words, but they're easily looked up. So they define a type of value system. You kind of get the idea of where this guy's coming from, what's important to him. Well, what about is that the end of it? If I develop a value system like this, am I stuck? Is that it? Is there any hope? Can it ever change? I think this gets into a primary reason why I have a lot less confidence in a system of understanding personal human behavior that is based on humanism, and that would be psychiatry primarily. They've done a lot of good in figuring out and categorizing people's behavior, but in understanding the human, there is no heart in that worldview. It doesn't work. So their understanding of why people do what they do is based on their understanding that a person has a certain personality, and if they do bad things in society, they're said to have personality disorders. They don't function well. They do bad things. Why do they do bad things? Well, it's just the way they are made. It's just the way their chemistry is. That's how they are. There's no soul. There's no heart. It's just the way they were made. So if that's the case, that cannot be changed. And that's the part of psychology that is lacking. It has no solution to offer. There's no hope within that system. However, from a Christian viewpoint, with an understanding that God created us, there is a heart, there is sin, there is things that affect our behaviors, there is this problem that includes our value system and desires. That is not personality. That is character. Character can change. So for a term that we can hang on to understand the difference, personality is very different from character. So what gives us hope is even the worst value system can be changed. And that's what I think is coming up in the sessions to follow this week, is the fact that it can and how it can and how to do it. But looking at values just on a minor sense, on a minor level, like just in this room, we're, I would say, generally good value systems. I'm going to assume it. I don't know you. So, but from day to day and week to week and year to year, our values are changing. They're flowing and flexing based on our circumstances and the things that impact us. And as time goes on, we get into different stages of life, and that affects our value system. For example, the 20-year-old who has high drive to make a business work and get it going and be successful, whatever it takes, when by the time they're 60, may not have quite that same look at business. Because it could be that over the intervening 40 years, things have happened to them to realize that there is other things that are more important. Maybe being the most successful businessman is not the most important thing. And then it changes. Now that's big, but it could be small, just day to day. There's things, I'm not going to try to list them, but new experiences and relationships will challenge our current beliefs and cause us to adjust. So those things are continuously present because we are living in continuous circumstances, and so they're having an impact on us. On a major level, let's look at the human heart. Well, let's just say, from that abuser's point of view, let's assume that he's not a Christian. It's sinful. It is born of flesh, and it has a sinful nature, and it has a certain value system. And what would you say that value system is based on? It's based on self, based on the flesh. But the blood of Christ has been shed to cleanse our hearts from sin. cleanse our value systems, to change our value systems. God makes cleansed hearts new. And perhaps in theory, some ways or another, they are totally erased and cleaned and we can start over. It's not totally true, not always true. It's different for everybody, but certain things can be drastically changed. Certain things are very little changed. But in any case, the cleansed heart has the capability of developing a whole new value system. Through the process of sanctification, through the Spirit aids us in changing our values, in adopting new ones. And that's the mystery. I think that's the mystery that the Spirit brings to this picture. We're not in it alone. It's the Spirit is involved, and how He works, I can't define it for you. I just know it. He does in ways I don't think we can totally understand. So, what do we do with values? How can we use them? What do we understand through them? I'd like to go into a little bit of a process again, defining how values are used, how we use them. And this kind of forms what some of us would call a heart model. It's just a little graphical description of how things relate in our heart. If we can understand that, it's really kind of an eye-opener to understand how these things work together, either in a pure heart or an impure heart. They're still working. The same process is working. So let's take a look at that. First of all, I want to look at, in the heart of a person who's converted, say, worshiping in the Spirit, worshiping God, how does this work? And, of course, to begin with, we have circumstances, but God is at the top. I put Him at the top because He's the primary factor in understanding this. He is sovereign over our circumstances and the people in our lives. They're there, and they affect us. Those circumstances have an influence on us. I won't define how, a variety of ways, but they are influencing us all the time. And we kind of have some choices to how we let them influence us. But they impact the way we think, and they impact how we feel. If somebody slaps you in the face, that's part of your circumstance. You're there, somebody's angry at you, hits you in the face, you're going to have some emotions. It's going to affect them. Now, the dividing line comes from what do you do with that? It does affect you, but what are you going to do with it? So then we'll get to that. And that's the dividing line is, what I mean to say is it does not cause our behavior. They affect us, but they're not the cause of it. So those things, here's going inside of us, our desires, which are based on our value system. That's inside our heart, right in the center. That's how do you graphically portray something that is immaterial? It's hard. So bear with this, just humble graphics here, but it's meant to just show that this is what's inside of us, and we do something with it. So these desires come in. And so what did I say? Influences. They influence us, and our desires tell us what we want. Our value systems are there to kind of give the pattern of our desires. And it drives what we worship. Tie that back to worship that we heard about before. This is part of worship. This is what's going on. Now, in the heart that desires God, it goes a certain way. We're created to desire God. God put that in us. I think that this capacity to desire was built into us from day one. It's part of being in the image of God. And I think He intended us to desire Him. He desired Adam and Eve to desire Him, to walk with Him, to be with Him. And he wants it to be voluntary, of course. That's where the problems lie, that he left it. We're not like animals that they do wonderful things and they do things for God, but they don't have a control of that. So we choose how to respond. We choose to obey God. We choose to sacrifice our desires for him. This is the ideal. And when it comes to responding, we respond well. Our good response, because our good value system and the good things we desire, this affects our emotional and spiritual condition. We generally feel better when that's happening. And it results in the fruit of the Spirit. Remember what the fruit of the Spirit is? We all know this. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. But what I want to tie back to, this is like a closed loop here. Our responses reflect how we view our circumstances. And what do we try to do with our circumstances? The heart that loves God, appreciates what he does, trusts him for the circumstances that we're in, seeks to thrive in those circumstances. How can I live in this? What can I learn from this? How can I please God in these circumstances? And remember, some of the circumstances I gave examples for were not pleasant. If I am in the middle of a circumstance where I am being marginalized, where I am being put down, I'm being criticized and not allowed to have what others have, that's part of my circumstance. How do I live in that? Is it based on the circumstance? No, it's not. It's based on my value system. It's based on what's important to me and how I respond to those circumstances. I guess that's a key point I want to get across here. We allow ourselves to be led by the Spirit in this kind of situation, and we experience that joy, and we do well in our circumstance. How did Joseph thrive in his circumstances? Didn't he thrive in them? He was abused. Seriously. But what gave him the ability to thrive in those poor circumstances? And we all, often I hear, well, it's because he had a godly upbringing and he got this, and Joseph and Jacob probably raised him well. Yeah, that's part of his value system. But didn't it boil down to the choice he made? He decided to respond to those poor circumstances in a way that he felt would please God. He had some understanding. He kind of knew what would please God, but he had the choice. He could have responded like his brothers. So I love that example because it defines well, it illustrates well this concept. So what about the other option, the other side? If we're living in the flesh, worshiping idols, how does this same process work? It starts out the same. We may be in the same circumstance. Same God is in our life. Same God is above our circumstance. Those circumstances provide the same kind of influence. They are influencing us, let's put it that way. They still impact our thoughts. They still affect our emotions. Can't change them. They're there. But now where does the change come? Our value system, our desires. Now we've got something we're wanting. These circumstances are flowing, they're influencing us, they're affecting us. But remember back in that process of idolatry, we've made a decision not to accept God saying no to something we want. So we want it. And now these two come together. The desires that we have, this value system we have kept them from God. We're controlling them. And they become lusts. And they become gods. And now is where rubber meets the road. We choose to respond in a way that we want. And we use idolatry for this. This is the process I brought up earlier. Remember this? I used seven pieces to describe it. But remember that one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. That sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. That's how James described it. So get back to this process that we're in. We have circumstances. God is out of the picture. We're being influenced. We want things. We've got to have them. And so now, sometimes those circumstances get in the way. We're going to change them. We're going to do everything we can to change those circumstances to meet our needs, to provide what we want. The idols are what we're worshiping, not God. And so that is the motivating factor to respond to our environment. And therefore, we see the seedbed of abuse. So let me summarize. I'm going to wind up a little early here, but I want to try to just keep it to simple concepts that you can grasp, that we all can hang on to. We all value something in our hearts, and that those values are based on our value system, the things that we have clung to. All of us are worshipers. We're always worshiping. We worship what we value. Tie that together. And it's always represented in what we worship. The things that are of value to us reflect and are reflected in our worship. And I want to tie this to the following session coming up in morals. These really are three key pieces. We have worship, the concept of worship. We have things we desire, and then the morals that result from them. So how we respond in this feedback loop of response, that's what we define as morals. You find a moral person will have a solid, good set of values. They desire the right things. They worship the right things, and they respond well. The opposite is true otherwise. So when we're talking about misguided values, the values that result in seeing abuse is not a big issue, because the value of life is not there. Value of human relationships is not there. The value of peace is not there. So let's tie this together. Misguided morals result from misplaced values, and they are reflected in misled worship. And therefore, that's reflected in what we think, what we say, and what we do. This little diagram is kind of puts it all together in one little piece. It's in your notes there. It is not perfect. There's pieces missing, but I want to try to capture the idea that they just don't happen. There's things going on in us that is important for us to understand as we go forward. Try to understand, why do people do these things and how can they be corrected? I want to thank you for your attention. I appreciate it, and God bless you as you go forward and get more out of what's coming.
All right. Once again, let's reflect a bit. What are some of the important things that you heard here this morning?
The worst value system can be changed.
That's a hopeful statement. Floyd says the worst value system can be changed. That brings hope. Okay, someone else.
change of focus for values, let me say it a different way. The focus that treasures the things that matter, we generally want to associate them with financial or business success, but very true that it affects our value system and operations.
Orrin comments that treasure is typically referred to or thought of as business and finance, but in reality, treasure is really in our value system.
Value system is represented in our worship.
Value system is represented in our worship. Very true. Let's continue processing, looking for those nuggets that we can take home with us and put into practical theology next week, next month, next year. Tom introduced this book, Solomon's Guide to Worship Disorders. I noticed one thing that he did not mention in his presentation. He did not mention who the author of this book is. That may be of interest to you. You've just heard him speak in the last 2 sessions. So thank you, Tom, for your gift to us.